In 2017, The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild released to incredible fanfare. It was showered with praise, bombarded with perfect and near-perfect review scores by media outlets. When players got their hands on it, their reactions were of a similar nature. Declarations regarding its quality were bandied about with fervor. It's the best open-world game, they said. The best Zelda game ever made. And many went so far as to declare Breath of the Wild their favorite game of all time. It was seen as a new standard for the genre, and today, every new open-world game inevitably gets compared to Breath of the Wild. Now, from the way I'm talking, you might expect I disagree with those people. That I believe the hype around Breath of the Wild was unwarranted. But no, that's not where this video is going. I think Breath of the Wild was a magical game. A true masterpiece whose innovations continue to be imitated. Its art style, its climbing system, its stamina management, its paraglider, and even the careful minimalist use of its background music has served as inspirations for the many games that adapted those systems into their own frameworks. I believe Breath of the Wild deserves its success, it deserves its popularity, and it deserves the huge sales numbers that it got. But there is a problem. Because Breath of the Wild is not like other Zelda games. It eschews many of the staples and traditions that the series was known for. It blazes a path forward in an entirely new direction. A risk that paid off for Nintendo, but if you were a fan of Zelda that didn't like the changes introduced, that preferred the more classic style, then this situation was very worrying for you. Because Breath of the Wild's popularity and success made the future of classic Zelda games quite uncertain. Many of the early Breath of the Wild reviews talked about how the series had become repetitive, predictable, or stagnant, and that the latest entry breathed new life into the series. This was a common perspective, even among players, and its prevalence effectively split the community in two. On one side are the Zelda fans who prefer Breath of the Wild to the older games, and on the other are the Zelda boomers who fear Breath of the Wild's success means their preferred Zelda archetype is doomed to extinction, or at least much less likely to remain a mainline staple. And it's this division and this group of players that I want to talk about today. I want to explain why the boomers are afraid, what their objections are to Breath of the Wild, and the likelihood of Nintendo moving in a direction that makes both groups happy. So, what is people's problem with Breath of the Wild? Well, if you've spent any time talking about this issue, then you've probably heard the phrase, Breath of the Wild is a good game, but it's not a good Zelda game. I hear this sentence all the time. The complaint being levied is that Breath of the Wild deviates so far from what makes a Zelda game that it can barely be considered a Zelda game at all. There are no dungeons. The sprawling, complex, multi-level labyrinths are probably my favorite part of Zelda games, and they're completely removed in Breath of the Wild. Instead, we have the divine beasts. One of the criticisms of old Zelda games was the predictability of the dungeons. You go in, find challenges you can't interact with, find an item that lets you interact with those challenges, and then you use that item to beat the level and the boss. Frankly, I don't understand that criticism. I think it was a great formula. It was a formula that worked. And what did we get in exchange exactly? The divine beasts are not dungeons. They are tiny, empty, shallow puzzle rooms the length of 3 to 4 shrines. Now, I admit the process of getting into the divine beasts is usually pretty cool. There's a lot of excellent spectacle involved in working with the champion's successors to approach the machines. But that's where my praise stops. There's not a single redeeming quality inside the beast's interior. We traded beautiful, lengthy, thematic, and unique dungeons for these short, ugly, goop-filled mechs that no self-respecting Zelda fan would dare call a dungeon. And then each of these shrine-and-a-half worth of puzzles inside the beasts culminate in the worst, least memorable roster of bosses in any Zelda game. Which is odd because Breath of the Wild really is a visually stunning game. The art style is very clear and there's a lot of variety in its designs. Yet despite this, all 4 of the main bosses look identical. Older bosses were way better. They looked different, they were in different environments, and each was defeated in a different way. If you show me a picture of a good Zelda boss, I could probably describe the fight, and maybe even what its dungeon looked like. If you show me a picture of a blank Ganon, I doubt I'd be able to tell you which one it was or what divine beast it came from. They're completely forgettable. Stuff like this is why I find the accusation that old Zelda was boring and predictable so baffling. So you're telling me the dungeons and puzzles of older titles were repetitive, and so the solution was to replace them with 4 divine beasts and 120 shrines that look and feel exactly like one another? Dungeons were distinct. They each had a different flavor. They often had a theme connected to the biome they were in, and they had great music to reflect that theme. You could navigate and solve puzzles immersed in the atmosphere of each of these dungeons. Breath of the Wild's shrines had one atmosphere. They all looked the same, and they all had the same song playing. Quick, tell me, what's your favorite Breath of the Wild shrine? I bet you can't think of one, and if you can think of one, it's one of the shrines where you didn't have to go inside to solve it. One of the ones where the puzzle was in the overworld. Because the insides of the shrines suck. Well, maybe suck is a little harsh, but they're certainly not an adequate replacement for dungeons. A Zelda game without dungeons and with no good bosses is like a pizza without cheese or sauce, and that's just bread. I don't want Breath of the Wild. I want a pizza. Do you remember in Twilight Princess when you get the last fused shadow piece and Zant shows up and wrecks everybody? The light spirit tries to fight him but gets one shot. He mocks Midna for even trying to use the fused shadows, literally tosses them aside like they're trash. He curses Link to be permanently stuck in wolf form. Then he brings the light spirit back to mortally wound Midna with exposure to the light realm. The whole scene was awesome. Zant was a villain with some presence. Even his creepy saliva mouth helped flesh him out. He was a scary guy. Link and Midna then get teleported to safety by the light spirit, but Midna's still dying. Midna's Lament, the best song in the game, starts playing in the background. Your only hope is to get to Zelda, so you go through the overworld, and then through the castle town. But you're stuck in your wolf form, so you have to navigate through the city streets and figure out how to get to the castle. This shit was good. If you played Twilight Princess, I bet you do remember this part. I bet you have Midna's Lament on your Spotify playlist. One of the best things about this section is that it isn't a cutscene. It's not something that happened in the distant past, it's something that's happening right now and searing itself into your long-term memory. The problem with Breath of the Wild is that it has no equivalent. There's no sad or somber moments. Link never has to leave his grandma or his childhood friend. There's no part where he fails or where he's tricked. There's no decisive moment where the narrative shifts and he needs to realign his goals. If any of those things are present at all, it's through the memory cutscenes. All the emotional highs and lows have already happened in the distant past. And you don't even have a compelling central villain to orient you. Skyward Sword had Girahim, flamboyant, loquacious, and powerful, with a great theme song. From his design to his dialogue to his presentation, Girahim has it all and he knows it. You fight him repeatedly throughout the game, and each time he loses more of his composure, and the fight increases in intensity. Wind Waker's central antagonist was less present in the adventure and more subdued, but is still one of my favorites. Wind Waker lets us see an older Ganondorf, one who has had time to mature and reflect, clinging still to the idea of a Hyrule long buried. Even the original Ganondorf for Ocarina of Time was memorable. When you first enter his tower, the Ganon's Tower theme starts to play. It's not very noticeable at first since it's quiet and can easily be drowned out by the noises of combat. But as you get through the enemies and climb the tower, it becomes faster and louder. When you cross the final threshold, the music reaches its climax, revealing that it wasn't simple background music. It was Ganondorf playing his own theme on the organ. These are villains with some impact, and Breath of the Wild has none of it. Ganondorf's organ playing may be simple, but it's the kind of thing that Breath of the Wild doesn't have and would have greatly benefited from. Even if the things I mentioned wouldn't have fit Breath of the Wild's tone, then they should have added something that would have fit the tone. What do we get with Calamity Ganon exactly? I'll tell you what, nothing. We get nothing. There's no indication that any of the main bosses are conscious. You might as well have an environmental disaster be the central villain. They took moments and bosses that were iconic and memorable, the kinds of things Zelda was known for, and replaced them with nothing. That's what the real issue is, not that what we got is bad, but that too much of what was important was taken away. Okay, all the things I've just mentioned are basically why old Zelda fans are unhappy. The dungeons, the puzzles, the bosses, and the story are all very different from what a Legend of Zelda game traditionally is. And what we got in exchange was worse. There are other criticisms, but these are the ones that relate most to the idea that Breath of the Wild isn't a good Zelda game. Now, let's move on to why this is a problem. Because if Breath of the Wild was a one-off Zelda game, then the old fans wouldn't care so much. Because if Nintendo started a spin-off series that imitated Breath of the Wild's open world, but also planned to continue making traditional mainline Zelda games, then everything would be hunky-dory. But there's no evidence that that's going to be the case. And in fact, what evidence does exist cuts in the other direction. In a December 2017 interview, Eiji Aonuma was asked if Breath of the Wild had impacted his thinking for future Zelda games, or if he'd rather return to a more linear design. This is his response. Quote, "You know, I can't speak to what other people or other companies will do with their own games, but I think, for me, especially in terms of Zelda series, the incredible freedom that this game offers you and how well that's been received, to me, it means that freedom, that level of freedom, is something that needs to be maintained in Zelda games going forward. My eyes have been open to how important that is." So for example, if there was like, you can't do this because you don't have the right tools, or you don't meet the certain requirements, players are not going to want to do that anymore. So we wanted very much to incorporate that. Going forward, I think we would definitely consider that way of thinking when we create something in the future. End quote. So, that does not bode well for classic Zelda fans. It's obvious that what he's talking about is specifically situations in older titles where you couldn't interact with things because you hadn't found the necessary item yet, like the hookshot or the iron boots. The freedom Aonuma values means not needing to meet those kinds of requirements to progress. In a different interview, Aonuma mentions that making Breath of the Wild was the most fun he's ever had making a video game, which is saying a lot since there was famously a lot of troubled development when making other games in the series like Majora's Mask, Wind Waker, or Twilight Princess. This, combined with his previous statements, make it very likely he's not interested in making a more authored Zelda game right now, since by necessity that would mean restricting the player's freedom. Finally, the last bit of evidence that Zelda boomers are doomed is just a numerical one. Zelda games were always popular and mainstream, but Breath of the Wild is on a whole nother level. It sold over 28 million copies, a staggering number, 3 times as many copies as the previous best-selling Zelda game. It's very likely that there are more people who have played Breath of the Wild than any other game in the series. Given these numbers, it's possible that most Zelda players alive today were introduced into the series by Breath of the Wild. And if that's the case, then the old Zelda fans became a minority in their own community the moment that Breath of the Wild released. So, that's the current state of things. The future of Zelda seems primed to follow in Breath of the Wild's footsteps, and we boomers remain as a resentful bunch, crouched in our corners, fearing the future, muttering curses under our breath, and repeating to anyone who will listen, Breath of the Wild is a good game, but it's not a good Zelda game. Well, at least that's how many of my Zelda peers feel at the moment. But I have a different perspective. I may be a Zelda boomer, but I don't agree that Breath of the Wild isn't a Zelda game. I loved Breath of the Wild, and like I said at the start of the video, I believe it deserves every bit of praise and popularity it got. But more importantly, I don't see a reason why future titles can't appeal to both demographics. There's nothing about Breath of the Wild that makes it incompatible with what I want from Zelda games. Look at Elden Ring. It's a good example because it's actually in a similar position as Zelda. Like Zelda, Elden Ring comes from a more linear style of games, and transitioned into the open world genre. But unlike Zelda, Elden Ring kept the legacy dungeons they were famous for. They had all the freedom, they had the vast open world. You could go anywhere and tackle things in whatever order you wanted to. But the important point is that those iconic staples of the series were there, they were present. There's no reason why Zelda games can't do a similar thing. You could have Tears of the Kingdom incorporate the virtues of its predecessor, an emphasis on freedom, the joy of exploration, and then also include dungeons to that equation. Real dungeons, meaty, puzzle-filled labyrinths, with unique atmospheres that you can find as you explore. Something separate from the game world that would require you to go through a loading screen. That way they can be as big as they need to be. I don't think they'd have a problem with doing that since the shrines work the same way, putting you in a separate space to deal with the puzzles. If Nintendo offered just this one thing, as an olive branch to the old Zelda fans, I'm sure 80% of them would change their tune. If they did that and added a more traditional story, a more gripping story, then I think that would be enough for almost all of them. And I don't think either of those things are very unlikely. From the existing Tears of the Kingdom trailers, I think we're going to get a better story. After all, these events that are shown are happening to Link at the moment. We don't have to run around looking for past memories, and if we don't have to do that, then by default that means we'll have a more traditionally told story. As for the dungeons, I'm not the only person who thinks their return is likely. There's a lot of people who think the title and the imagery allude to us having to go through dungeons and acquire tears. There was also an interview before the official name announcement where a Nintendo representative said this: "As for why we're holding back on the name, you'll just have to stay tuned because obviously Zelda names are kind of important. Those subtitles, they start to give little bits of hints about maybe what's going to happen. So from that, we might conclude that the tears in the title are important because they could hint about what's going to happen in the game. And if that's true, then that's all the more reason to think that dungeons are possible." Finally, there's what Onuma himself said in one of the Nintendo Directs. He said, "As previously announced, the adventure in the sequel will take place not just on the ground, as in previous games, but also in the skies above. However, the expanded world goes beyond that, and there will be an even wider variety of features you can enjoy, including new encounters and new gameplay elements." Now, of course, that quote might be nothing, but he is saying that there's a lot more to the game that we haven't seen. We are less than 100 days until release, and we have still seen very little. At the time of recording, everyone is expecting a direct in February. And if you'll allow me to take a quick huff of my copium, then I'd like to predict that this next direct will showcase the dungeons and make it clear that the story will be more traditionally told. At least I really, really hope so. We old Zelda fans, we're not a complicated bunch. Give them the dungeons, give them the puzzles, and give them the traditionally told story, and I'm willing to bet you anything that these people that have been naysaying since the release of Breath of the Wild will be at the forefront, heralding Tears of the Kingdom as one of the best games ever made. I promise you. There's no need for us to have conflict, and if Nintendo is smart, they'll figure out how to make everyone happy. And that's the end of this video. Please unsubscribe and unclick the bell notification. If you're an older Zelda fan, please mock the younger generation for their lack of taste. And if you're a Breath of the Wild fan, then be sure to gloat about your superior numbers. If this video hasn't alienated anybody enough to do those things, then I will probably get you in a different video. Until then, thank you very much for watching.